Greetings, this is Amy Wentley with Chi Knuckles Knitting, and this is episode 2019-1, Geiger Cardigan, Measuring Stockinette Stitch Gauge. I'm teaching a class at the Hillsborough Yarn Shop on the Geiger Cardigan, which is designed by Nora Gahn for Brooklyn Tweed, and it's a highly cabled cardigan, very beautiful, done in Brooklyn Tweed Arbor. And it requires a number of swatches, some cable swatches, but also a stockinette stitch swatch. So this episode is going to talk about the stockinette stitch swatch, and it will show you how to measure and calculate gauge. So I started with the stockinette stitch gauge swatch. And I cast on 30 stitches. I worked 40 rows in stockinette stitch. One row would be all knit stitches, the next row all purl stitches, next row all knit, next row all purl. Just repeated for 40 rows. Then I bound off, I blocked the swatch, and I allowed it to dry thoroughly. So the first thing I do before measuring for gauge is I set some measuring lines on my swatch. And here's my swatch, and I'll have it oriented here so that I have the cast on edge at the bottom, the bind off at the top. And what I do is I weave in a contrasting lighter weight yarn to the right side, the left side, the bottom row, and the top row so that I can use those as measuring guides. And I'm going to show you how I do that. So here's my swatch, and I take a darning needle, and I take a piece of contrasting yarn that is longer than the length and the width of the swatch. I thread my needle. Here we go, thread, thread, thread. Okay. Then I'm going to start out on my right-hand side of my swatch. And I am going to identify 2 columns of stitches that I want to weave this yarn in between. I don't want to go to the very end because these stitches at the edge are irregular and they'll affect how you measure your gauge. So you want a good even swatch from the middle to measure from. And so I'm going to pick this column of stitches and this column of stitches, the columns of V's, and I'm going to go between those V's and I'm going to pick up a ladder between those 2 columns of V's and pull my yarn through. And I'm going to leave a tail there. I'm going to go up about 1/4 of the way, and in that between those same 2 columns of V's, I'm going to pick up another ladder between them, pull my yarn through, and I want to have a nice line to measure against here, so I'm letting the yarn float there. I'm going to go up to about halfway and pick up a ladder between the same 2 columns of V's, about 3/4 of the way and pick one up, and then I will pick one up at the very top of the swatch. And you want to make sure that this whole piece of yarn is going along between the same 2 columns of V's. It makes a nice line on the right side. We're going to do the same thing on the left side. I'm going to thread my needle again with the contrasting yarn. I'm going to start at my left side, and I'm going to come in a few stitches from the edge because I don't want that curly edge on the left again to be involved in this. So I'm going to go between 2 columns of V's again, pull my yarn through and leave a tail, go up about 1/4 of a way between 2 columns of stitches, and pull through. Go up about halfway between the 2 columns of stitches, pick up the ladder, pull through, go 3/4 of the way up on a ladder between the 2 columns of V's again, and pull through, and then to the very top of my swatch between those same 2 columns of stitches and pull through. I learned this method through the Knitting Guild Association, and I find it's a really good, accurate way to get gauge. So that's why I do it this way. So now I'm going to put measuring lines at the bottom and the top of my swatch. So I'm going to thread my needle again. And I'm going to go through the bottom of a V stitch across a whole line along the bottom. And I'm going to count up from my cast on. I'm going to go ahead and count up about 3 stitches. Now I'll do 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to come in that 4th V up. And that's going to bring me through the bottom of that V stitch. I'm going to come about a quarter of a way through and count up 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll count up about halfway through and come up 1, 2, 3, 4. 3/4 of the way through and count up 1, 2, 3, 4. And to the end, count up 1, 2, 3, 4. And so I'll have a straight line along the bottom of my swatch, right there. And then I'm going to do this one more time across the top of my swatch. I'm going to thread my needle. I am going to start at the right hand side and I'm going to go to a bottom of the V and I'm going to count down about 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches from the top. Get into that V stitch there and leave a tail. Okay. Come about a quarter of a way through and count down 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that's right. Yep, you want to keep a straight line. So about halfway, count down 1, 2, 3, 4. About 3/4 of the way and count down 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. Is that straight? Let's see. Nope, that's actually up 1. So you want to make sure you get across a straight line across. So I only counted down 3 stitches there. So let me fix that. Because you want to make sure you have a straight line above all. So count down 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. That should be a straight line, I think. Yep. And then at the very edge, count down 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you are set. Okay. Good. Good. Okay. So we're good. So we have our measuring lines there. What's important is that we can measure through the middle here and side to side here and have an even width. Okay. So now we're going to talk about measuring and calculating gauge. Okay, here we go. Actually, you know, there's a lesson here because I see again that this isn't totally straight and it's bugging me to pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and count these stitches one more time and believe myself this time. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. Yay. And then I'm going to count down at the edge. 1, 2, 3, 4, and now this should be straight. Yay! Okay, so even if you've been teaching for a while, you need to redo things if you don't get it right. So there you go. Now we've got a good, strong square. Everything's straight. So now we're going to talk about how to measure and calculate the stitch gauge. So for this pattern, the gauge is 23 stitches and 34 rows for 4 inches. Okay, so we're going to start by measuring the stitch gauge. We're going to measure from the left to the right yarn, our measuring points, left to the right, and we're going to measure that to the 1/8 of an inch, and that's going to give us our inches. Then we're going to count the number of stitches from the left to the right, and that is going to be the number of stitches. And then we're going to divide the number of stitches by inches. There's a weird date on this piece of paper, and I don't know why, but ignore that. Divide the number of stitches by inches, stitches per inch, and then multiply the stitches per inch by 4. Okay, so let's start measuring from left to the right to the 1/8 of an inch. So here's my 0, and I'm going to put it along the green line at the left, and I measure across, and that's 4 1/4 inches. Okay, 4 1/4. So that's 4.25 inches. And then I'm going to count the number of stitches from the left to the right. And the way I do this is I take a pointy thing and I count the V's. And you want to be sure that you are counting across the middle. That's going to be your best and most accurate measurement. So I'm going to count stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So I have 24 stitches. Now I'm going to do some math. And we'll bring out my calculator. Here's my calculator. There's my granddaughter back there. That's Leona. And I'm going to bring out my calculator, and I'm going to divide stitches per inch. So I counted 24 stitches, and I'm going to divide it by inches, which is 4.25, and I get 5.647. So that's stitches per inch. So I'm going to write that down. And I'm not going to clear my calculator at this point, so that's stitches per inch. And then I'm just going to take this number and I'm going to multiply it by 4 to find out how many stitches are in 4 inches. And it's 22.588. Now, that's not exactly 23. What this means is just by a little bit, my garment is going to be a little tiny bit wider than the gauge for the sweater calls for. And that's okay with me because I am going to do a size that maybe I could use just a little bit more room in. And I'm only talking about maybe a 1/2 inch to the whole thing. So I'm okay with this gauge. If you round it up, it's 23 stitches per inch. Okay, so I'm fine with that. If I felt like I was picking a size that was probably going to be too big anyway, I might want to think about changing needles at this point, but I'm okay with this. So let's measure and calculate row gauge now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to measure from the bottom to the top yarn to 1/8 inch. Then we're going to count the number of rows from the bottom to the top yarn. Then we're going to divide the number of rows by inches, and then we're going to multiply the rows per 4 inches. So here's my gauge swatch again. There's my bind off. There's my cast on. So I am going to measure from this green line, which is actually the bottom of this stitch here, to the top here, right there. And so I get about 4 1/8 inches. 4 1/2, 4 1/4. Let's see. I would say 4 1/4. Yeah, 4 1/4. 4.25 inches. Okay. Then I am going to count the number of rows from the bottom to the top. So I started with this one, so it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. So 34 rows per 4 1/4 inches. So now I'm going to do the division. It's going to be 34 rows, 34 divided by 4.25. So 34 divided by 4.25 equals. That gives me 8 rows per inch. And if I multiply that by 4, that gives me 32. rows per inch. Okay, the gauge says it's supposed to be 32 rows per 4 inches. I'm sorry. The gauge says it's supposed to be 34 rows per 4 inch. So I'm off by about 2 rows per 4 inches. Now again, row gauge affects how long your garment is. And I am okay if this ends up being just a tad longer than what the pattern calls for. If you recall too, I was kind of like on the edge. Do I measure for an 1/8 inch or 4 1/4 inch? So, you know, I'm somewhere between there. So I'm in the ballpark and I'm going to be okay with this too. If your row gauge is off, it's harder to change your row gauge with your needle choice. So if you are kind of on the fence and you have an instructor that you can consult, you might want to talk about your options if your row gauge is way off. So that's how I measured gauge on the Stockinette stitch swatch for the Geiger. The next video I do will show you how I measure gauge for some of the cabled swatches. And then we'll go ahead and we'll be starting the sweater. So look forward to those videos. Thank you for being here. Bye.